had the riots in Paris, when the French had to bring out the troops in the tanks, Marcuse was there. When they had the riots with the students in Berlin, Marcuse was there. We are convinced that he has to convey some of his ideas and thoughts directly to the students, and in this lies the danger of Marcuse to the University of California.
One of the only things I knew about San Diego was that Herbert Marcuse had been here. I came to California in 1992, a foreigner like Marcuse. I had heard about Marcuse back in Denmark. There was a picture of him in my contemporary philosophy book. I would often return to this photo. The text said, in connection with the student uprisings, Marcuse was focused on by the press, and for the rest of his life, he was a philosophical media event.
He just threw a tear gas grenade.
Today, philosophy is seldom a media event. Could this place tell me why the visionary force of a youth movement had been over 70 years old? Or why his ideas had inspired some and terrified others 25 years ago?
Herbert Marcuse taught me that it was possible to be an academic and an activist, a scholar and a revolutionary.
Looking at this student of Marcuse's at age 24 brought me back to 1968, about 10 years after the emergence of the civil rights movement and several years into U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. Angela Davis is known as a defender of civil rights, a Black Panther, and a radical college professor.
Herbert Marcuse was committed to an immediate political activism and speaking at rallies. Of course, in 1968, in France, with the great student uprisings, there, Marcuse's name was invoked, and he spoke.
Students were demonstrating outside at the university. Tear gas was flying. Marcuse arrived at the conference hall and was suddenly surrounded by reporters. He was really sort of upset by this. He didn't like being trailed by video cameras down the aisle of the auditorium. And of course, what this was all about was newspaper stories that had been published in the preceding weeks saying that Marcuse was the thinker who had inspired the student revolt that was going on outside.
Andrew Feenberg was another philosophy student of Marcuse's and was in Paris when the demonstration sparked off a national strike by 10 million. The workers locked out both the union and the management and joined the students. And according to the newspapers, the demonstration started with a book.
One-Dimensional Man provided a theoretical base for not relying on the working class, but instead looking to marginal groups for leadership in the struggle that might hope to someday to penetrate the core of the system.
His writings about the frustrations of modern man in contemporary Western society have been especially popular in Europe. Professor Marcuse teaches philosophy at the San Diego campus of the University of California. Well, how is it, Professor, in this country of unprecedented prosperity that there can emerge so powerful a force of discontent?
I believe it is precisely because of the prosperity that you have such a tremendous spread of discontent. How instead of construction, destruction is practiced.
What do you mean destructive uses? I don't...
For example, the entire military establishment.
Well, setting that aside.
For example, planned obsolescence. For example, the production of innumerable brands and gadgets who are, in the last analysis, always the same. It is much more the pressure of a standardized conformist and, in the view of the students, utterly corrupt and hypocritical society. And they experience that immediately enough in order to revolt.
San Diego was, and probably still is, a very conservative community. The university was therefore, in that sense, extraterritorial. That is, it's as though we were an embassy from some other planet. They didn't know what we were doing. We didn't particularly have to pay attention to them. Now, what happened in the Herbert situation was that one fine day, Herbert participated in New York in a radical discussion with a number of otherwise well-known people, among whom was H. Rap Brown, who was then one of the leaders of the black movement and whose immortal sentence, you may remember, it is that violence is as American as apple pie. And the people in the area heard that Herbert Marcuse, sitting there on the platform with H. Rap Brown, was a professor at UCSD. They'd never heard of him before. They didn't know who he was or have the slightest idea of what he stood for, but that catalyzed a lot of feeling.
Earlier this week, a group of 1,000 outraged citizens took out an ad in a local newspaper demanding that McGill's inauguration be called off. They also demanded that philosophy professor Herbert Marcuse be fired. Well, Marcuse didn't attend today's ceremonies, and McGill is now officially the chancellor, and the campus is quiet.
We were set down in a community that first had no experience with the convulsions that periodically take place at a university, and that was deeply militarily conservative. And the identification of everyone who might, say, oppose the war in Vietnam or who might advocate civil rights, the identification of such people as revolutionary communists. It's ridiculous.
Recently, wherever they had a riot in Europe, they had the riots in Rome, and Marcuse showed up. They had the riots in Paris when the French had to bring out the troops in the tanks. Marcuse was there. When they had the riots with the students in Berlin, Marcuse was there.
They said interesting things. They said, for example, it's not the influence of his books, they're incomprehensible. It is, in fact, his value as a role model. Students, undergraduates, see this leftist. He's a very attractive figure. They're tempted by that. We must get rid of this person.
It seems to be that wherever the radicals in this new left, so-called new left, appear, Marcuse somewhere is in the background. We are convinced that he has to convey some of his ideas and thoughts directly to the students, and in this lies the danger of Marcuse to the University of California.
Where our government during the war in Vietnam?
The American Legion was very powerful here in San Diego. It set itself up as the arbiter of the morality of the rest of the citizenry. During the McCarthy era, it had managed to exercise great power at other schools, at San Diego State, for example, and to get faculty people dismissed. And I suddenly realized that I was in conflict with the American Legion over Herbert Marcuse when they wrote me a letter.
The Legion proposes to offer $20,000 to buy up Professor Marcuse's contract. You don't buy up a professor's contract. You can't even do this with a professional football player, and a university is a far more responsible place in our society.
The letter that offered to do this came to me personally, but it also was, I read it in the newspapers before I got it, so that I could see what was up here. And it's perfectly evident to me that they were working hand in glove with the editor of the local newspaper here in San Diego, San Diego Union, and that this was going to be a press campaign.
So in this way, via Paris, Rome and Berlin, the name of Herbert Marcuse and the youth movement reached San Diego. Why did Marcuse come to San Diego? Why did he come to a Navy town that only a few years prior to his arrival had passed a law allowing Jews to buy real estate? What was the attraction? I came across a picture of Marcuse in a French magazine. He's on the way to a conference with his friend, Reinhard Lettau. Lettau was a writer and was active in the German student movement.
I had an order, police order in my hands to leave Germany because of some speeches I'd made and so forth. In the same week, I got an offer as a full professor at UCSD. And I told him, and he warned me not to go because he said it was extremely boring, you know, Southern California. He liked it. For a reason I never understood. I don't know, maybe you have to be old. I'm really old, over 70, to like San Diego. I don't know. I don't know what it is. It has everything I don't like. It's too much sun, everybody is healthy, and health is considered beautiful. Something beautiful, whereas health for me is not at all beautiful. I grew up in Nazi Germany, where I become sick and tired of health. It's and this eternal happiness, but he liked that he himself liked. I guess I've known many immigrants who said the same thing about California. There must be something about it. It's a complete antithesis, I guess, to Europe, which is gray and blunt and real.
San Diego is a town where post-war prosperity was based on military industry. One of the fastest growing cities in the US, it was built on a desert and turned into gardens, golf courses and suburban condos. In the midst of this, I found Marcuse on the beach.
He has his routine of walking all the time, so we knew that if we got up to the beach, we shall see him, but he wouldn't stop, he wouldn't like to talk, he came to walk, and that's what he came to do.
With salt water in my eyes and sand in my hair, I found myself reading Marcuse on his favorite spot in San Diego. I was beginning to get it. Phrases from the banners in Paris 68 echoed Marcuse's demands for social change in an affluent society. All powers of imagination, love and revolution, honor the cobblestones, the beach. Marcuse's revolution in disgust of affluence was also a revolution for joy. How were these new demands made in Southern California?
We were demanding a college. We wanted a college. They were about to construct the third college. We said the name of this college is going to be Lumumba Zapata College. Oh, yes. And we developed a curriculum.
We developed the idea of creating a college that would reflect the needs of the academic as well as community needs of people of African descent, Latinos, and working class white people.
We wanted to demonstrate the extent to which we were serious. We decided to occupy the registrar's office. So I went to Marcuse and told him about our plans, and I asked him whether he would come with us. No question about it, of course. And as a matter of fact, when we took over the building, we had to we had to kick in the door, break the glass, and the first person to occupy the building, the first person to set foot into the building was Herbert Marcuse.
In the wake of yesterday evening's takeover of the Registrar's office, the Black Student Council and the Mexican-American Youth Association held a rally in the free speech area of the campus at noon today. They issued the following statement. The taking of the Registrar's office was the only course of action because the Academic Senate had not met the demands of the supporters of the Lumumba Zapata College. This afternoon, Dr. McGill held a news conference, and he discussed last night's incident.
The matter's not closed. Somebody's going to have to come forward and pay for that door.
was very mysterious. One day a letter arrived, and inside the letter was a money order for the amount on the bill. No signatories, no indication of who was paying it. And I figured that I wouldn't inquire, the matter was settled.
And Marcuse paid for the door. Yeah, he went, and I don't know, it must have, I don't know, $20, $50, whatever it was. So he paid for the door of the registrar's office.
Mm-hmm. The Blancos could tell me about Marcuse's encounter with what at that time was called the Third World.
His cultural heritage, of course, we know, I mean, in music, Beethoven, right? And Mozart and so forth. He didn't know anything about Latin American music, African music, and so on and so on.
He quite couldn't understand the Third World, and that was my main concern. But always saying, but you can teach me.
And he didn't have a single problem with it. Not a single problem. I mean, the problem he had is, but you also have to study Plato. I said, yeah, we have to study Plato, but we also have to read Fanon.
I think that humility is very difficult to find in many people.
We haven't used the word. Humility is important.
It's very hard to find in people of the stature of Marcuse. I mean, I wouldn't dare to tell another professor, says, listen, you know, here, this in this book, you know, here are the dates of what happened in Bolivia and Chile, all the American interventions, blah, 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 blah. And then the next day he has assimilated that into his speech
and into his thinking.
As the women's movement was taking shape and emerging, Herbert was declared an honorary woman by a women's organization and, because they appreciated the importance of his work.
You went into an office like no office you'd ever seen in the philosophy department. He had at least 20 to 30 figurines of hippopotamuses. Pink hippopotamuses, green hippopotamuses, hippopotamuses with their mouths wide open, hippopotamus candy jars. And he loved hippopotamuses. He would speak of them as a bizarre animal. And he felt they embodied the reality of absurdity and the immense possibilities of the imagination.
He seemed to be able to talk about pleasure in a way that made sense. We had all grown up in the 50s and in this very affluent but somewhat affectively impoverished world. In Eros and Civilization, he was very optimistic about the degree to which human beings could achieve a fuller, richer, more ecstatic sexual existence.
Going back to May '68 in Paris, one of the slogans was "Demand the impossible." And for Marcuse, the hippopotamus was the living example of the impossible. And yet, a hippopotamus is crucial to the environment it's in. It becomes a link between the land and the river. And it would process massive quantities of food and be a conduit into the river. He would find the university functioning as a research lab for the Department of Defense to be far more offensive than the university functioning like a fat and absurd hippopotamus that would glean knowledge in one arena and then take that knowledge and spread it in another. We know the university spreads a lot. It would be nice if they spread knowledge.
I found an image of a bearded, long-haired student confronting Chancellor McGill. An image that turned into a person gazing through the windows of the philosophy department as if looking for a thought that had disappeared 30 years ago. Maybe Barry Shapiro had returned to look for a ghost.
His door was often open, and that was probably the most wonderful sight of all, because that meant you could walk in and chat with him. And one could see from here where all the political stuff was going on. I recall that I gave many, many speeches standing on one of those benches over there. On TV, in the student lounge, right down there, we would watch Huntley Brinkley showing us images of GIs lighting huts on fire. And we wanted to tell, did you watch TV last night? Did you see what we saw? Are we participating in this willingly? Who were these people that were driving from their homes? What is the strategic purpose of this? Research to support the war machine was going on for killing and harming people in our name. And people in conscience. Lettau, certainly a man of conscience, supported the putting one's body on the line, of throwing one's body on the wheels, of stopping the machine.
Wait a minute. We know what the Marines do throughout the world. We know what they're doing throughout the world. Should we give them the right? Okay, how many people want the Marine recruiter to talk? How many don't? Where is the Marine recruiter?
Well, if you're going to shout back and forth, anybody can shout, right? So the first man, can I field one question?
What is the purpose of being in Vietnam? The I want to frame here
The violence is certainly not with the students. The violence is on the part of those against whom the students protest. Those responsible for and supporting the criminal policy of extending the war in Southeast Asia.
Nevertheless, isn't this a disruptive activity which harms the university?
If this disruptive activity contributes at least a little in stopping the insanity, I think it is more than justified.
During that era, there was a student here named George Winnie. And George Winnie was very upset about the war in Vietnam, distraught even. Much like the Buddhist monks in Vietnam, he lit himself on fire right here in this area. He doused himself with gasoline, struck a match, and went up in a burst of flame.
In the name of God and the war, wrote George Winnie on his suicide note. Was it individual protests like this that made people afraid of Marcuse and the New Left? Or maybe it was this. Images from the very spot where Winnie had immolated himself. A generation of students imagining a community that could bridge nations, gender and races were pouring into the streets. Today, it's hard to imagine. Nowadays, the free speech area on campus is half the size and hardly ever fills to half its amount.
Well, Reagan was governor at that time. His stock in trade as a politician is a kind of nice guy image. You'd love to have him as your next door neighbor because he's friendly and decent. But in fact, as a real person rather than a political image, he was a rather mean, uncompassionate, very hard-bitten person. What struck me as I got to know him a little bit was that he had absolutely no understanding of any of these ideological concerns and no sympathy at all with the idealism of students.
Marcuse was almost the antithesis of Ronald Reagan in his openness, in his sense of playfulness. Ronald Reagan's idea for the university was actually published in a very large document called the Rationalization of Education. And for Marcuse, this would be the exact opposite of the purpose of the university, and his every act was in opposition to rationalizing. He was into imagining. He was into pushing possibilities.
Over 100 people have been shot down. 100 people that I'm sure the record will show. Gas, lethal gas, that has been classified, as far as I know, is being used.
Once the dogs of war are unleashed, you must expect that things will happen and people being human will make mistakes on both sides. But this violence...
We're here because people are being shot and killed today in Berkeley.
He said to me at one point that he had all the experience he needed with communists in Hollywood during the 1940s, and he said the only thing they understand is force. So we'll give them force.
Negotiate? What is to negotiate? What is... Don't you, wait a minute, on that issue, don't you simply explain to these students that the university has a piece of property that it bought for future construction of the campus and it was now going ahead with the plan?
The people of
What do you
Governor
mean,
Reagan own that
negotiate?
land. Governor Reagan, the time has passed when the university can just ride roughshod over the desires of the majority of its student body.
Well,
the university is a public institution.
That's
it's an
right.
important institution
But the university...
for all of its own community and for the community of Berkeley that live around it.
All of it began the first time some of you who know better and are old enough to know better let young people think that they had the right to choose the laws they would obey as long as they were doing it in the name of social protest.
I've seen some of the characterizations Reagan made of Marcuse, which were erroneous, which were demonic. And you hear him making slogans about what Marcuse stands for, his character, his nature. Nothing about the fact that the man was respected internationally, was not a member of the Communist Party, was not a communist. He criticized communism.
You have a very extreme professor, such as Marcuse, poisoning, literally poisoning, a lot of young minds with what I would consider to be some of the most irresponsible drivel that I've ever read or heard. And I think that we should focus more on training these young people to be productive citizens and not to dissect and examine the whys and wherefore, the motives of human beings, and to try to find some aberration upon which to fix.
It's sort of like the infection theory. I mean, after all, an intellectual such as Marcuse, all he has is his mind and his pen and his voice. So there's no threat in any real sense other than what that might do. At least some of representatives from the right had threatened Marcuse's life. There was a period where he was actually kept in a very careful custody by his most dedicated graduate students.
He wasn't somebody to hire bodyguards and try to tough it out. He and Inga fled to friends up in Central California, and he came back months afterward when all this furor had died down.
We ourselves, some of us, carried arms in order to protect Marcuse. After Malcolm X was killed, Bobby Kennedy was killed. We thought it was possible for someone to assassinate him. And at that point, some of us were prepared to fire on an assassin.
April 1968. Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis. June 68. Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles. And July 68. Marcuse flees San Diego after death threats. And on the other side of the world, there were similar reactions.
The Soviet Union responded to Marcuse's growing popularity by denouncing him as a CIA agent. Now, he was a CIA agent, if you stretch things a little bit, during World War II, he was put in the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA.
Marcuse worked against Nazism for 10 years, became a US citizen, and never returned to live in Europe. Who was this person I was looking for? What experiences had shaped his philosophy? I had gone 30 years back searching for Marcuse in San Diego. Marcuse himself had gone 30 years further back. I searched the Marcuse archives in Frankfurt for answers to his origins, work and popularity in the student movement. In the 1930s, Marcuse belonged to a group of writers, scholars and cultural critics, later known as the Frankfurt School. As Marxists, Jews and critics of fascism, Marcuse and the others went into exile when Hitler came to power in 1933. I found Marcuse's German passports. One of them had a US immigration stamp from 1934. Marcuse and his colleagues first arrived in California and began analyzing the failure of the left in the 30s, the rise of fascism in Germany, and emergence of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. The writings of the Frankfurt School were rediscovered 30 years later by the youth movement and posed an alternative to Cold War ideology. There was also a pile of letters from the 1960s addressed to Marcuse.
Hey, you worthless pig. I hope you are soon eliminated from this country, and I hope the world, you anarchist, atheist, murderer, getting paid by the people of California to propagate hate and bloodshed.
After learning of your classroom antics, I have come to wonder, along with many veterans of World War II, if Hitler wasn't right after all. If you were really sincere in your beliefs, you would emigrate to Russia. I wish you ill fortune.
Sir, you have various colored ants in your head, and they wish to get out, but you will not let them. See a doctor, a merry-go-round. Why don't you try painting?
Marcuse, you are a very dirty communist dog. We give you 72 hours to live in the United States. 72 hours more, Marcuse, and then we kill you.
Were these letters scary remnants of an ideology that had passed by? The presumption, consumer paradise was here to stay, and one was not supposed to feel insecure. Quoting Walter Benjamin, a colleague from his Frankfurt days, Marcuse wrote on the last page of One-Dimensional Man, "It's only for the sake of those without hope that hope is given to us." Benjamin never escaped fascism. Fearing persecution, he committed suicide at the border between France and Spain. And here was Marcuse supporting students in an anti-war sit-in. Marcuse had made it to the US, and 30 years later, he was again taking hope in the hopeless. This time in a generation of youth that aligned themselves with the exploited and outcast, excluded from a system of abundance. Was Marcuse a meteor hitting Southern California, and I today looking for the crater?
My sister was a student of Marcuse at UCSD. She and her husband were physically attacked by the police. As a matter of fact, her husband, Sam, was shot. The police literally broke into their house. And I mention this because Herbert Marcuse was the faculty member who was responsible for organizing the campaign to raise their bail and to have them released from jail. It was actually as a result of police activity that this whole incident went down, not my sister and brother-in-law were simply at home, but they had been known to work with the Black Panther Party in San Diego.
If I understand the theory, there is supposed to be some redeeming virtue for participants in violence, that it lets them work out their frustrations and get them out of their systems, and that this somehow does them some good, and that therefore it is a positive social good to engage in violence.
No, you see, that I consider a vulgar psychological interpretation, which is in addition not applicable here, because it completely overlooks the motives and objectives of the protest movement. But there is, we talked about it, this difference between the violence of defense and the violence of aggression.
Even criticism of the war was difficult and often led to police suppression. So if demonstrators were attacked by the police and fought back, I think Marcuse did not feel that that was something that they had to be ashamed of or that you had to denounce. What you had to denounce was always the greater violence, and that was the violence of the state.
I gather you are a bit ambivalent about the use of violence.
What do you mean by ambivalent?
That you have mixed feelings. You sometimes think it is good and other times think it's bad.
I think that anyone who loves violence for the sake of violence is a fatally sick human being.
Last week, 177 Americans were killed. South Vietnamese dead totaled 248, and enemy dead 1,478. In the same week, 3,000 more United States troops arrived in South Vietnam, raising the total to 438,000.
It's a very strange and twisted view to argue that Marcuse was somehow a philosopher of violence who advocated violence. I mean, think of the society. Probably in the time when he was putting forward these views, 1 million people died due to the American war in Vietnam. So who is the advocate of violence? Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, or Herbert Marcuse?
Sickler, Barry James from Sacramento. Sorensen, Donald Roberts from Lakewood, California. Sorrow, Charles Finney Jr. from Santa Barbara. Sousa, Robert Patrick.
Well, there was certainly violence against people in the Paris riots.
Counter-violence. That I have seen. The students were perfectly peaceful. And the police got orders first to clear the court of the Sorbonne and then to clear the streets. And you know that they don't do that exactly in the way of a nursemaid singing the baby to sleep.
Counter-violence is okay, in your view?
It's not a question whether or not it's okay. It is a question when and where it is necessary. Necessary in order to keep alive yourself and what you stand for.
Aha, I have it now. Sometimes it's okay.
You don't have it because you will never get me, not because I'm afraid, but because I want to be honest. You will never get me to say that I advocate violence. If I would say so. I mean, in this respect, I'm by no means a coward. But I don't think I can take the responsibility for advocating violence.
The necessity of keeping yourself and what you stand for alive. Could Marcuse forget the many who didn't say no during the 30s? Can we forget that Hitler gained power democratically? The paradox of freedom. Sometimes people freely choose to be unfree. And the questions of authority, civil disobedience, and violence merged again when Governor Reagan opposed the hiring of Black Panthers as guest lecturers at the University of California.
The movie actor who was at that time governor of California came up, and the academic senate met, and there was a debate on what kind of a demonstration we're going to have, the faculty, and they did vote it would be silent.
With absolute silence. So there was a mass of hundreds of students waiting there, and it made him very angry. It was a very successful It was a very success, since he was used to being yelled at by students, and indeed that was a very useful matter for him politically.
Reagan's style as governor was to try to provoke these attacks. And if he could provoke an outburst, then people would say, see how they treat our governor.
Governor, what do you think of this well-disciplined, quiet demonstration compared to some of the disturbances you've encountered in the past? This is purposely done this way.
Well, and I'm very appreciative of it. I think it's a little more adult than some of the things we've seen in the past.
They hope that this will have an effect on the region in their decisions today.
Well, it would be fine if they really understood what was going on, but they don't.
You don't think they understand what's going on?
No.
And the whole faculty and campus was standing there dead silent. And somebody behind me, it might have been Peter, said oink, oink, real loud, quietly. And Marcuse yelled real loud, who said oink, oink? That kind of thing I enjoyed very much. He was immensely ugly, Reagan. I said that to him as he passed me.
Their ideas that there is some plot to destroy the university on the part of those of us or some of us in the Regents meeting are obviously a revelation that they don't understand. For heaven's sakes, who do they think on the Board of Regents would want to destroy the university? Who do they think in the government of California would want to destroy such a great institution? Someday, perhaps they'll understand that there are people trying to destroy this university, but I'm quite sure they're not to be found on the Regents or in the government, and more likely they're to be found among them on the campus.
The student movement had a complicated relationship to the media. The whole world is watching, yelled protesters in triumph in 1968 as they made the news. But perhaps someone is watching too much.
Still photographs and television tapes will permit identification of the remaining disruptors. Each of these will be referred to appropriate campus disciplinary agencies for a prompt hearing and for appropriate action.
Murphy had them photographed. I wouldn't let the governor of California intrude on our independence and freedom of the faculty to operate this school as we saw fit, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let a group of students do it either. That is, we govern the University of California, we faculty, and if the students wish to join us, let them become faculty.
We had a picket line in front of this very questionable, oily character by the name of McGill. He was a chancellor, sort of an extremely opportunistic, not terribly intelligent, fat man.
I was just anxious to have it out. And if this SOB, I'm thinking of a significant faculty member, is going to participate in something like that and wear a bag over his head so he can't be identified, I'm going to put that SOB in jail if I can. That was the way I felt.
And a sentence to the maximum penalty, which is in California, I think $2,000 that was, and 21 days in jail. And that was, of course, one of the most central and most important experiences of my life.
I believe that the fight is just beginning to start. the fight against all those who want to make your university a training school for the perpetuation of a society, the security of which and the prosperity of which is based on the oppression and enslavement of other peoples.
One of the largest to gather at UC Berkeley this year. The speaker, New Left philosopher Herbert Marcuse and his student, avowed communist Angela Davis. UC Regents fired Miss Davis from her job as an assistant professor of philosophy at UCLA after she admitted to being a communist.
Sit up there.
At the same time, because Marcuse didn't agree with the political step that I took in joining the Communist Party, he never held that against me at all. He continued, of course, to support me and continued to provide guidance, both in terms of my scholarly work and my political work.
Later, Marcuse supported Angela Davis when she was put on trial in relation to the Soledad shootout. Images went all over the world. A 26-year-old professor on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, charged with kidnapping, murder and conspiracy, became a cultural hero and symbol of black liberation. This was a time when philosophies of social change overflowed the confines of academia and scholarly journals and spread into the streets, and philosophers became media celebrities.
I remember that Playboy magazine asked him for an interview, and they offered him a large sum of money. And this is what I recall. Marcuse debated the matter, thought it over, and decided it was really impossible. But rather than simply declining, he said he would do it only if he could be the centerfold. And of course that didn't fly with Playboy, and so he was never interviewed by Playboy.
So, a 70-year-old professor had simultaneously unified the American Legion in San Diego, the Pope in Rome, Pravda in the Soviet Union, the Republican governor in California, and the Vice President of the United States. All of them feared and condemned this single figure for corrupting the mind and manners of the youth. Was Marcuse asking too many embarrassing questions about the Cold War? How could the institution, called the University of California, San Diego, finally deal with this hybrid of a Californian beach boy and present-day Socrates?
The University of California, San Diego today announced its intention to reappoint Dr. Herbert Marcuse as Professor of Philosophy for the academic year 1969-70. A very careful review of the academic merit of Dr. Marcuse's reappointment.
The decision was that we had to get him retired, and we had to do it with dignity. That is, he had to be able to put down his appointment voluntarily at a certain age,
but not under the threat of removal by the governor, and not in a way directed at him personally.
Accordingly, we have decided to terminate all existing commitments to overage professors as of June 1970, and to replace these with a policy of expected retirement at a specified age.
Marcuse himself did not like the idea of being forced out at age 70. He thought that he still had some things to say. And we said that we wanted him to give up his faculty appointment, although he would be free to teach classes as he wished.
Dr. McGill, would you say that this new policy you've just inaugurated was a direct result of your problem concerning Dr. Marcuse?
No, it was not.
Dr. Marcuse phoned into KSDT this reply to Chancellor McGill's statement.
It is not my reappointment that is at stake. I have quite a few offers to teach, in spite of my biological age. What is at stake is the right and the duty of the scholar and educator to teach the truth and to expose the lies. It serves or ought to serve whole generations of human beings, regardless of race, color, religion, and business requirements.